All right, let's dive into this. The Posthumous Memoirs of Brás, Cubas.
By Machado de Assis.
Yes, we've got excerpts from the novel itself. And they were translated by Flora Thompson DeVoe.
Right.
And then along with that, we've got some critical analysis to help us unpack this whole thing. It's a masterpiece, right?
It is.
So here's the kicker. We've got a memoir, but it's narrated by a ghost.
Yes. And I think what's so fascinating about this setup is how Machado de Assis really plays with our expectations as readers.
Right.
So if you can imagine, like, the narrator of this book, Brás Cubas, is dead. And from beyond the graves, he is talking directly to you, the reader.
It's like a seance.
Exactly.
Where he's just telling us all about his life.
You become Brás Cubas's confidant in a way. But I think what this also does is it makes you complicit in his perspective, which, as we'll see, is often very skewed. And so it's just a really genius way, I think, that Machado de Assis, it kind of implicates the reader in the story, blurs the lines between fiction and reality.
Okay, so we've got a ghost story, a memoir, and metafiction all rolled into one. I can already tell this deep dive is going to be pretty wild.
It is.
So before we get too far into Brás Cubas's, escapades and all of that, I think it would be helpful to sort of set the stage in terms of, like, when this book came out and, why it's considered so radical for its time. So the late 19th century, really, really different from what everybody else was doing.
Yeah. Yeah, it's true. So when the posthumous memoirs first came out, critics were perplexed, to say the least. His style is so witty and it's sharp and it's surprisingly modern. And he wasn't afraid to really experiment with form and structure. And this was a real departure from kind of like the literary norms of his era.
So, like, he was ahead of his time.
Totally.
It says here, eerily fresh.
Yes. Yeah.
His style. That's so interesting. I wonder what what his contemporaries must have thought.
I know. Well, there's actually this great anecdote about Machado de Assis's brother-in-law, basically having to encourage him to, like, ignore the bad reviews. Like, don't worry about them. Just keep writing for those who, quote, understand your work, end quote. And thankfully he listened.
That's awesome. Persistence.
Yeah. Yes.
I love that.
Yeah.
And thank goodness he did, because, later critics like John Gledson and Roberto Schwartz, they, recognized his unconventional approach.
Yeah.
And they argued that the book's structure, the seemingly arbitrary structure, actually mirrors the arbitrary nature of Brazilian society at the time.
It's true. Yeah. So it's not just like this kind of like experimental thing that he's doing. It's a critique woven into like the very fabric of the storytelling. So it's like if you're watching a film, for example, that jumps around a lot in time, it can be really disorienting, but it forces you to kind of actively piece together the story. And that's what Machado de Assis is doing here. He's challenging you to really think critically about the world that he's depicting.
So it's not just like a clever literary device. It's actually social commentary.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked about Machado de Assis. Let's talk about this Brás Cubas character.
Yes.
Our ghost narrator.
Our ghost narrator.
So he is described as a wealthy, idle bachelor with a disagreeable head and frivolous tendencies.
Yes.
Not your typical hero.
Not at all.
So obviously he's a product of privilege, right?
Yes, very much so.
And that definitely shapes his perspective. And this is where the whole unreliable narrator thing really comes into play, right?
Yes. I mean, one of the big takeaways from like all the critical analysis I read is that like you can't really take anything that Brás Cubas says at face value. You always have to remember, like, who is this guy? What are his motivations?
Right.
Like, what is he trying to get out of telling this story?
Yeah. So, and there are a lot of examples of that, but just one that jumps out is the anecdote where Brás Cubas witnesses a slave being whipped by his former slave, Prudencio. And Brás Cubas doesn't even flinch. He seems completely unfazed by this.
Yeah.
Why? Why is he so unfazed by this? What does this tell us about him, about his perspective?
That's a great question. And it really gets to, I think, the heart of Machado de Assis's brilliance. He's not giving us easy answers. He's not giving us, like, clear moral judgments.
Yeah.
He's presenting these really complex situations, and then he's kind of inviting us as readers to grapple with the implications of that.
Right.
So I think Brás Cubas's kind of indifference to the suffering of others really highlights the dehumanizing effects of a society that's built on inequality.
So this makes you question everything he says and everything he does.
Absolutely.
The whole time.
It's like he's holding up a mirror to human nature, I think.
Right.
With all of its flaws and hypocrisies. And that's just the beginning. I think as we delve deeper into Brás Cubas's escapades, we're going to uncover even more layers like irony and satire and social commentary.
Yeah, I think so too. And it's going to be fascinating.
Okay, so we've got this Brás Cubas as our, well, morally flexible narrator.
Right.
So let's look into how that perspective like colors his relationships.
Yeah.
With others. And the excerpts that you pulled focus mostly on two women, Marcella and Virgilia.
And they don't really paint the picture of lasting love.
No.
It seems like he's more infatuated with love than actually like experiencing it.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I think what's interesting is that both Marcella and Virgilia represent, I think, something that Brás Cubas wants but can never quite possess. So Marcella, this beautiful Spanish woman, right, who he meets early on, she's kind of like the embodiment of a like youthful passion, but she's also very materialistic.
Yeah, he goes into debt.
Yes.
Trying to woo her.
He does. He spends lavishly on her.
It's like he was trying to buy her love.
Yes, exactly.
Which obviously backfires.
Yes, totally. And you know, the sources really point to this experience with Marcella as something that really shapes Brás Cubas's kind of cynical view of relationships moving forward. Like it's almost like he learns from this experience that love is transactional.
Yeah.
That it's a game to be played and not, something real or genuine.
Which I think makes his relationship with Virgilia all the more interesting.
Yes.
Because it's not just this fleeting passion, it's this forbidden, like, societal, like, there's a lot more to it, a lot more layers.
Yeah, absolutely. So Virgilia is married to this guy, Lobo Neves, who's this ambitious politician who eventually becomes a provincial president. And their marriage is very much one of convenience. There's no real passion there. No real affection. So Virgilia is kind of vulnerable to Brás Cubas's charm.
And he knows that.
Yes, and he very much uses that to his advantage. And so their affair becomes this like cat and mouse game, you know?
They have to sneak around behind Lobo Neves' back.
Yeah.
There's like a whole network of people that they have to deceive, family and servants, high society gossips. And Brás Cubas seems to really relish in the secrecy and the thrill of this forbidden romance.
Well, yeah. He calls their love nest a gem of a house.
Yeah, it's very over the...
Where they could escape societal constraints.
Yeah, he's romanticizing it.
Yeah.
To the extreme. But that's, I think, what's so brilliant about Machado de Assis, right?
Mm-hmm.
He allows Brás Cubas to kind of spin this narrative, right, of love and passion. But we, as readers, are always kind of aware of the moral complexities and kind of the impending doom that's hanging over this relationship.
Right.
It can't last forever.
And then when her husband is offered this prestigious position in Portugal.
Yeah. That requires them to move away. So, obviously this is a threat to their whole affair. And he thinks he can convince her to leave her husband and run away with him.
Yeah. She gets pregnant.
Yeah.
Right. Huge plot twist.
And so, I mean, this is a real consequence now to their action.
Absolutely. So we see Brás Cubas's reaction to this news is initially excitement. He starts thinking about, we can build this idyllic life together with this child, but then tragedy strikes.
She loses the baby.
She does. It's a devastating loss for both of them. And I think this really marks a turning point in their relationship. So Virgilia decides to stay with her husband.
Right.
And Brás Cubas is kind of left alone to confront the consequences of his actions and the reality that, his selfish desires have ultimately led to like pain and heartbreak.
Wow. Does this change him at all?
I think that's the question that Machado de Assis leaves us with as we continue kind of exploring the posthumous memoirs and we see how he kind of continues to navigate like these complexities of life and death and love and loss and grapples with his own legacy.
And so there's this chapter that he claims escaped Aristotle, where he compares human relationships to billiard balls.
Oh, yeah.
Bouncing off each other?
Right. Transferring, what does he call it? Disgruntlement.
Yes.
Which is just so Brás Cubas, right?
Yeah.
He's got to have this, like, detached and kind of humorous way to describe human interaction. But I think, like, underneath that humor, there is a deeper layer of social commentary there, right? He's talking about the ways that, like, we impact each other often negatively within the confines of, like, these societal structures. Like, we pass on our frustrations and our anxieties onto one another and kind of perpetuate this cycle of discontent.
It's like he's saying that even our closest relationships, they're just transactions.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. Like, I think you can definitely draw a parallel between that observation and his interactions with Marcella and Virgilia. Right? It's all about, like, this exchange, this kind of, like, give and take. And then there's also this other analogy that I thought was really interesting, where he compares public opinion to solder.
Yeah, so he's basically saying that these shared beliefs, even if they're based on nothing.
Right, even if they're flawed.
Like they hold society together.
Yeah.
Like solder.
It's a fascinating observation, but again, I think it's very cynical.
Right, yeah.
He's suggesting that, like, we're all complicit in maintaining the status quo.
Right.
Even if we recognize, like, the flaws of that system.
Even if we know better. Yeah, I think so. So, okay, but it's not all doom and gloom. This is a book that's full of wit and humor.
Yes, absolutely.
Right, and sometimes a little bit of Brás Cubas's philosophy of the nose can be a welcome distraction from these heavy topics.
Right.
Remind us, what was that about again, that philosophy of the nose?
So Brás Cubas's philosophy of the nose, I think you can think of it as, like, his method for dealing with the complexities of life.
Okay.
So he uses his nose, metaphorically, to kind of, like, distance himself from the world and focus on his own desires. So it's like this self-preservation mechanism that allows him to, navigate difficult emotions, difficult situations.
And it leads to some really humorous situations.
Yes, absolutely. Like that anecdote where he finds a gold coin and spends, like, a whole chapter justifying why he should keep it.
Yeah.
Like classic Brás Cubas. But so I think one of we were talking about his relationships with women and stuff. And but then you've got, like, Brás Cubas' old friend Quincas Borba.
Yes, the one who falls into poverty and madness.
Right, exactly. But before he totally loses it, he invents this whole philosophical system called humanitism.
Okay, so humanitism.
Yeah.
And so what is this, like, a philosophy that says, like, just be as selfish as you want?
Basically, yeah. Like, imagine a philosophy that says selfishness is not only natural, but it's, like, the driving force of progress. So it's, like, really pushing you to question, like, societal norms.
So he says some wild things. Like, he says that envy is an admiration that struggles.
Yes.
And then he tries to justify violence.
Yeah.
As, like, for progress.
Yes. And he talks about how hunger, it's necessary for human progress. It's like, it's so out there that you can't help but laugh, but then it also makes you kind of think, like, is there something to this?
Right.
Like, is he on to something here?
Yeah. It's like he's saying, here's this crazy thought.
Yes.
What do you think about it?
Yes. And that's the genius of Machado de Assis, right? He uses humor and satire to present these really radical ideas. But it's ultimately, like, he's forcing us to confront, like, these uncomfortable truths about human nature.
Yeah.
And about ourselves, right?
He's not preaching to us. He's prompting us.
Exactly. And that's why I think the posthumous memoirs of Brás Cubas is considered such an enduring masterpiece.
It stays with you.
It does.
After you read it.
Absolutely. And so before we wrap up this section of our deep dive, I did want to just take a moment to acknowledge Flora Thompson DeVoe.
The translator.
Yes, the translator.
Who translated this book.
Yes, because, I mean, to bring a work like this, from 19th century Brazil into, like, modern English, it's no easy feat.
Yeah.
And she even mentions in the introduction how initially hesitant she was to take on this project, but then she became completely captivated by Machado de Assis's style.
And there's this great anecdote about this bibliomaniac who's obsessed with deciphering all this, like, nonsense in the book.
Yeah.
And they can't let go of the mystery.
Right.
And so it's like translating this work, it's like solving a literary puzzle.
Yes.
And Flora Thompson DeVoe, did such a good job of capturing all these nuances. of his voice and his wit and everything.
Yeah, I totally agree.
Yeah. So I'm starting to understand why this is like such a masterpiece. There's so much to unpack.
Yes.
So many layers of meaning and interpretation.
And we've only just scratched the surface. Like, there's still so much more
Yeah.
to explore. So get ready, because in the final part of our deep dive, we're going to be delving even deeper into Brás Cubas's reflections on life, death, and his, search for meaning.
Welcome back. It's the final part of our deep dive into the posthumous memoirs of Brás Cubas.
I have to say, this book is really making me think about things differently.
Yeah, me too.
I mean, that's the thing about Machado de Assis, right? He just flips everything on its head.
Right.
Makes you question everything you thought you knew.
Makes you question life and death and everything.
Everything in between.
Exactly.
Then the way he does it, with humor, makes it all the more brilliant.
Yeah. So we've seen so far how Brás Cubas, our charmingly unreliable narrator, is giving us this recounting of his life from beyond the grave.
Right.
All these witty observations, these cynical anecdotes, but there's also this introspection.
Oh, absolutely.
That I feel like we haven't really dug into.
Totally. And even though he is often frivolous and self-absorbed, I think Brás Cubas does have these moments of genuine self-reflection. Like, in one part, he compares himself to a wandering or famished butterfly, flitting from one idea to the next without any real purpose.
Oh, yeah.
It's a surprisingly poignant image.
Yeah, I thought so too.
Coming from him.
It's like he's admitting his own, mediocrity.
Totally. But there's this melancholy and resignation there.
Right.
Which I think is really interesting.
And the fact that he's making this self-critique from beyond the grave just adds this whole other layer.
Right. Talk about irony.
Yeah. It's like death gave him this clarity that he didn't have in life.
Right. Maybe that's why he's so, preoccupied with legacy and what he leaves behind.
Yeah. I mean, he does famously say, "I did nothing."
Yeah.
Which is, such a
wild statement.
Yeah. What does that even mean?
It makes you think, right? What is a meaningful life?
Yeah.
Is it about achievements, recognition, or is it something else entirely?
Exactly. And Machado de Assis doesn't really give us an answer.
No, he doesn't.
He just kind of puts it out there.
Right. He wants us to struggle with it, to figure it out ourselves.
And Brás Cubas, he's having this existential crisis, but it's all wrapped up in Machado de Assis' wit and irony.
Right.
It's like this dark humor that you can't help but laugh at, even though it's kind of a heavy topic.
Yeah. And it's not a one-time thing either. He keeps doing it, throwing in these observations, making us think.
Yeah.
The philosopher of the nose, human relationships like billiard balls, public opinion as solder, all these things that stick with you. It's like he's giving us these puzzles to solve.
Yeah. So with the solder analogy, he's basically arguing that shared beliefs, even flawed ones, are what keeps society together.
It's a pretty cynical take.
It is, but it kind of makes sense, right?
I mean, think about it. How often do we just go along with things?
Yeah.
Even when we know they're not, right?
Right. And then there's Quincas Borba with his whole humanitism philosophy.
Oh, yeah, that's a wild one. Self-interest is the ultimate good.
Right. It's almost comical, but then it's also maybe he has a point.
And that's Machado de Assis' brilliance. He uses this satire to expose these uncomfortable truths about ourselves.
Makes you look in the mirror a little bit,
Yeah.
So as we wrap up this whole deep dive, what's the takeaway for our listeners? Why should they care about a book from over a century ago by a Brazilian author?
Because it's timeless. This is a book that speaks to the core of what it means to be human. It's about ambition, love, loss, the search for meaning.
Right. It stays with you.
Oh, absolutely.
Long after you finish reading it.
Makes you think about your own life, your values, your choices.
Yeah, and it's all done with this incredible wit and literary skill.
It's just brilliant.
So here's our final thought for you. What if Brás Cubas, even though he says he did nothing, what if by telling his story, he actually achieves something profound?
That's an interesting question.
What if his memoir, with all its flaws and cynicism and self-reflection, is actually a testament to the power of stories?
I like that.
Right. So there you have it. That is the posthumous memoirs of Brás Cubas.
By Machado de Assis.
A masterpiece that's worth a read and a reread, and probably a few more after that.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
It was a pleasure.
We'll see you next time.